So let's talk about the 9th edition Codex releases so far, and why I generally think that Games Workshop is doing quite well. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about the first Codexes of 9th edition. So far we've had 4 full Codexes released, and 4 Codex Space Marine supplements covering the more divergent chapters. Today I just fancied having a chat about the positives of these Codex releases, as I think all too often it's very easy to focus on the negatives and what could have been done better, as opposed to the great many things that in my opinion have been done right with these releases. So first up, we'll talk about the things that I think Games Workshop has done well with the Codex rollout, and then finish up by going over a few of my bigger criticisms. As always, I'll be really interested to hear your opinions, so feel free to let me know your thoughts about the 9th edition Codexes, whether positive or negative, down in the comments below. So one of the things that Games Workshop I think has really quite excelled at in the new Codexes is getting quite good internal balance within the armies. Just generally speaking, over the 4 big codexes, Space Marines, Necrons, Death Guard and Drukhari, at least compared with the 8th edition dexes, there are comparatively few auto-include units, and again compared with 8th edition, very few units that you never include under any circumstances in an army list. We can all name some notable exceptions that might well be struggling, but at least compared with many other editions in the game, I think that almost every unit in the army has a good battlefield role, which is really quite impressive considering the size of some of these dexes, like Space Marines and Necrons, considering all their new releases. Despite having almost 100 datasheets, I'd say the majority of the datasheets in Codex Space Marines remain very playable, which I think is no mean feat considering just how many variants of Space Marines in Power Armor you can field. Only a few seem to have slipped through the gap somewhat, things like Reavers and Assault Marines. Perhaps the worst internal balance in Codex Space Marines might be that a lot of the armor doesn't really work all that well. It kind of does okay, but not really quite to the same sort of level as troops that can get rerolls on characters and things. I felt that the Drukhari Codex was really quite well done. I'd say every single unit within the Codex seems very playable to me. Maybe there is a bit of competition for certain roles between one unit and another, but literally none of them just seem outright bad or unusable right from the drop. Again, Necrons I think are very well balanced, maybe just a few really standout ones, and a few duds like the Reanimator and Death Marks. And Death Guard almost everything seems usable, besides perhaps things like Land Raiders and Predator tanks being a bit outclassed by other options. I know it's very easy to point at the things that don't work, but in general I think they've done very well to make as many of the units viable as possible. It's quite a bit rarer where you look at 2 units within the codexes and see one as just flatly better than the other, which did kind of happen all the time throughout earlier codexes through 8th and 7th edition. On top of that, I quite like the way that they're trying to make multiple different ways to play each army. Space Marines were kind of the gold standard for this, having entire books to every single chapter and giving you genuinely different experiences when playing each of them. Necrons have scope for building both ranged and melee builds, and you could go in on some big hitting strategies like the Silent King or Catan Shards. Death Guard allow you to build solidly around infantry, demon engines, or even poxwalkers, particularly with their new formation. And there are a few really interesting innovative detachments, such as the Drukhari ones where you can field that real space raid detachment or their usual patrol thing, or the unique options given to the Dark Angels, Deathwing and Ravenwing detachments, allowing them to field very fluffy and powerful builds. I feel like these are all aimed so you can have different ways of building the same army, and they can be really quite distinct and give you different experiences even when playing with the same faction. I do quite like the way that each race gets their own mono-faction army bonus as well, similar to Space Marine combat doctrines. I think it's pretty interesting between getting the most powerful units from a few different factions, compared with remaining pure, having fewer options, and getting a decent buff on top of that, such as Necron command protocols, Death Guard contagions, or Drukhari power from pain. Aside from balance things, I think that Games Workshop have made quite an effort to really increase the fun factor of these recent codexes. By dedicating a few pages to narrative play and the Crusade section, it allows them to make use of a lot of fun rules for the faction, maybe ones that are quite hard to implement in any sort of balanced tournament style game. I thought that the Death Guard were quite fun for this, the Chaos Boon table looks quite interesting, and it's very fitting to be carrying your own army's custom contagion and spreading it to new enemies. I really quite like those points cost style upgrades that they seem to give in each new codex now. For example, upgrading the Space Marine characters to Masters of the Chapter with a few points, making Blood Angels Death Company characters, or the Death Guard Deadly Pathogens to amp up their plague weapons. I feel like that's another little extra factor of interest that adds to a codex, and it lets them really focus in and flesh out one aspect of the army. I quite like the way that it allowed getting things like Cabalite Trueborn and Hecatrix Blood Brides back in the Drukhari Codex. They'd been sorely missed for an edition, and by having bespoke rules like this, it gives them the opportunity to really make them feel as they're supposed to. Finally, whether it's the army's overarching special rules, or actual individual bits on the datasheet, I think there's been a real drive to try and make the rules as lore-driven as possible. For example, if a model behaves a certain way in the fluff, to try and make it represented on the table, and give as many interesting little bits of detail on the model their own unique rules in-game. Perhaps that Contagions of Nurgle ability for the Death Guard was quite good, having enemy models get physically weaker and easier to kill if they're near the Death Guard, and they're afflicted by the horrible diseases that the Death Guard Plague Marines carry when they get too close. So here are just a few other things that I really quite like about the new codexes, before we round up with a few criticisms. I'd say that the 9th codexes generally have quite a good feel-good factor when they come out. They do tend to deliver a meaningful update, so you're not just feeling like you're buying the exact same thing that you had before. Almost every single unit, war gear profile, and many of the special rules have been changed, and most of the time it does seem to come with a decent power buff for the faction. Necron certainly went from one of the weakest armies in the game to a fairly solid one, and both Dracaria and Death Guard went from fairly middling kind of armies to being really quite strong each in their own right. I know Codex creep is often a much maligned part of 40k, but at the same time, a small power boost certainly does make a Codex a lot more interesting, and feel a bit less like you're just getting more of the same. I do quite like the way that they seem to have looked at every single unit's datasheet in detail, and had to think about what sort of things could help to make it work a bit better or feel more fluffy on the table. They certainly don't always get it right, but it does feel like the effort has been made. I'm personally quite a big fan of the good FAQ support that Games Workshop offers on codexes these days. I know FAQs are a bit of a divisive subject. Obviously it would be better to have every single rule perfect in the codex, but with a game as complex and as deep as 40k, I'm willing to forgive a few errors or things that need a small tweak. Generally it seems that the 9th edition codexes don't need quite as many tweaks as many of the 8th ones, and I'm of the camp where I'd much rather have small rules errors or areas of ambiguity fixed quickly, rather than letting months go by with no clarity at all. In 6th and early 7th edition, Games Workshop just didn't bother with this whatsoever, so I'm glad that they offer us official answers at the moment. I think they're also doing quite well with the balance updates, not being too quick to jump in and nerf a codex, but when the dust settles and things might not be functioning quite properly, things like a few small points changes or rules tweaks, such as the Eradicator's nerf, seem like good revisions for the health of the game overall. Otherwise, I like the way that there's quite deep sub-faction rules now. Again, back in 6th and 7th edition, I would have been very surprised to see, say, unique rules for every single guard regiment, or anything in-depth for the individual Tau Seps, yet here we are in 9th, and those things all happen routinely. I think they've been doing well with the stratagem revisions, a few less auto-include or game-breakingly powerful ones, and a lot of ones with more interesting or unusual effects more restricted to individual units. The new system for picking points costs is so much easier than the one in 8th edition, literally every points cost right under the unit entry, rather than having to endlessly flick back and forwards. And just between every codex, I think that they're doing quite well to make some things fairly standardized, such as every faction seems now to be getting its own mono-faction bonus, so it's not just certain armies like Space Marines that get that now, and similar levels of sub-faction support with every single army, with options like custom craft worlds, dynasties, and cabals, cults, and covens now becoming the norm. So while in general I have been really quite enjoying these codex releases, there are always things that can be improved, though often different groups of people will want very different things for improving codexes. Here are a few of the ones that bug me the most. I'd say out of the codexes that have been released so far, I'd say that perhaps Dark Angels and Death Guard are the ones that are really breaking the mold quite so much in terms of power creep. Particularly for Space Marines, the Dark Angels codex just seems vastly stronger than a lot of the other options. It's not quite the dominance that, say, Iron Hands had in 8th edition, but within the other options for Space Marines, it's very hard to weigh things up to Terminators that always get transhuman physiology, or bikes that are harder to shift with invul save, and also get good support in stratagems and being able to obsec objectives. Death Guard, I'd say, are certainly ahead of the power curve as well, with units like their Terminators, Mortarion, and some Demon Engines, although maybe these two won't be quite so bad once every faction has been updated. Games Workshop's always going to release things piecemeal, one by one, to avoid just flooding the market with codexes, but it does mean there's likely going to be a big power gap between some of the best 9th edition codexes and some of the oldest or least functional 8th edition ones. Armies like Tau, Eldar, Genestealer cults, and Guard spring to mind. When they're releasing codexes with quite so much content, there's going to be a bit of a balancing act between rules bloat and creating interesting in-depth rules for a faction. Maybe the Drakari book is a good example of this. Essentially being 3 mini armies in one, there's an absolute ton of rules for each of the different sub-factions, including enormous vast options for various different custom cabals, cults, and covens. There could potentially be quite a lot of nuanced stuff to remember. I feel that if Games Workshop just keeps on going down this route, then each codex is going to be bigger and bigger than the last, until eventually we get to the point where they need to do a whole hard reset on the game, like they did at the start of 8th edition. Perhaps because of this expansion on rules content, we don't seem to get quite as much in-depth info on the background of certain units as we used to. That was particularly noticeable in the Space Marine and Necron codexes. In previous books you used to get quite a bit of info as to the backstory of each different miniature choice in the army. Perhaps because of those factions' enormous ranges, they don't tend to dwell on that quite so much. I think people aren't too much fans of the early DLCs type rules that are already appearing, say the Charadon expansions, the Drakari, Death Guard, and the upcoming AdMech. All of these do add interesting options, but it feels a bit weird to release a very small bit of rules content in really quite an expensive book, quite so close to when the actual codex is released. That certainly grates on quite a lot of people if you no longer have the full rules to play your faction just from the codex anymore. A lot of people aren't too happy about the no models, no rules syndrome that seems to plague a few codexes. Sometimes it can make the datasheets really quite weird looking, such as the Plague Marine one, where rather than having a fairly de-restricted datasheet like they had previously, you can now only take the options that came in the box. It can make the unit quite weird and complicated. Say if you run a Plague Marine unit that has a whole bunch of different Plague power weapons, rather than just being able to take many copies of the same one, which might make things a bit easier and look a bit more cohesive. Finally, a bit of a personal bugbear is the unique faction secondaries for me. I'm not sure how big a fan I was of the idea when they first were announced, with some armies having access to easier secondary objectives than others. I think they do add a bit of a fun factor, though they do run the risk of being very easy to unbalance. For example, the already strong Dark Angels have one where they only have to defend their home objective all game. If they can do that, then they max out secondary points, whereas many other armies have to work far harder to get their 15 points if they want it. Overall, I think that Games Workshop's Codex releases certainly aren't without criticism, and it is kind of our job to tell Games Workshop when we don't like things so they can hopefully do things better next time. But for me, for the 9th edition Codexes, the positives are outweighing the negatives so far. So anyway, let me know what you think about the Codex releases, and whether you think that Games Workshop is doing a good job. As always, I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll most certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new releases every single day. Finally, if you have been enjoying videos on the channel, I would just like to mention one way to help support and keep them coming, which is the link to the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all of these videos each day does take quite a bit of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support in keeping them coming is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.